Hi, my name is KT, and today I'm going to be presenting a research study that assesses the relationship between major depressive disorder, depressive symptoms, and attentional biases in children and adolescents. The article I chose was titled Transactional Relations Between Attentional Biases for Affective Stimuli and Depressive Symptoms in Offspring of Mothers with and Without Major Depressive Disorder. The study was conducted by Kelly Gare, Leslie Brick, and Brandon Gibb and was published in 2026 in the Journal of Psychology, Psychopathy, and Clinical Science. I chose this study because I thought it was interesting that the researchers were not just looking at depression itself, instead they were looking at something more specific, how depression may affect the way young people pay attention to emotional information. On a more personal note, I also chose this study because I am someone diagnosed with major depressive disorder as well as my mother, and I was curious to see how those correlated with family history of depression. Before talking about the study, a brief explanation of major depressive disorder, or MDD, is that it is a mental health disorder involving persistent depressive symptoms that can affect a person's mood, thoughts, emotions, and everyday functioning and can occur during childhood, adolescence, or adulthood. One important part of this study is that children who have a mother with a history of major depressive disorder are considered to be at increased risk for depression themselves. This does not mean that a child whose mother has depression will automatically develop depression. Instead, it means that they may have a greater vulnerability or risk. There can be several reasons for this increased risk, including genetic vulnerability, environmental experiences, family stress, and exposure to negative emotional experiences. The researchers were particularly interested in whether this family history might also influence the way children process emotional information. That brings us to the main concept of this study, attentional bias. Attentional bias is a tendency to focus more on certain types of information. For example, someone experiencing depression might pay more attention to negative emotional information, such as sad faces, or potentially pay less attention to positive information, such as happy faces. The main purpose of the study was to examine the connection between depressive symptoms and attention biases in children and adolescents. The researchers were especially interested in whether these two things influenced each other over time. Previous research had suggested that people with depression may pay more attention to depression-related information such as sad faces. However, much of the previous research with young people was only looked at in specific context and only at one point in time. The problem with that is it makes it more difficult to determine what comes first. For example, if a child with more depressive symptoms also pays more attention to sad faces, we don't know whether their paying attention to sad faces contributed to their depression or whether the depression is caused by them paying more attention to sad faces. This study attempted to address that problem by following the same children over a period of 2 years. The researchers collected data at 5 different points in time, approximately 6 months apart. This allowed them to examine changes over time. The study also looked at 3 different emotional expressions: sad, happy, and angry faces. The main focus was on sad faces because the sad emotional information is especially relevant to theories of depression. The researchers also wanted to know whether their relationship was different for children whose mothers had a history of major depressive disorder compared to children whose mothers had never experienced a mood disorder. The study included 242 mother-child pairs. There were 123 children whose mothers had a history of major depressive disorder and 119 children whose mothers had no history of a lifetime mood disorder. The children were between ages of 8 and 14, with an average age being about 11.35 years. About 51.65% of the participants were girls and 48.35% being boys. The sample was based on a predominantly non-Hispanic white demographic. The researchers originally recruited 255 mother-child pairs, but 13 participants were excluded. 4 were excluded because the mother of the controlled group developed major depressive disorder during the 2-year follow-up period. Another 9 participants were excluded because they did not have usable eye tracking data for at least one of the 5 assessment points. The researchers also looked at whether the children themselves had a history of depression. At the beginning of the study, 17 kids met the criteria for lifetime history of major depressive disorder, and 2 met the criteria for current major depressive disorder. This is important because the researchers were primarily interested in depressive symptoms rather than only studying children who had a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. The children and their mothers were followed for 2 years, which gave researchers the opportunity to examine how symptoms and attention changed over time. The researchers in this study had several important questions. Firstly, do attentional biases predict future depressive symptoms? If a child pays more attention to sad faces, does this predict an increase in the depressive symptoms later? Do depressive symptoms predict future changes in attention? They hypothesized maybe depression changed the way a child processed emotional information. Lastly, does a mother's history of major depressive disorder change these relationships? The researchers expected to find bidirectional relationship, meaning they expected attentional biases to predict later depressive symptoms, while depressive symptoms would also predict later attentional biases. They also expected these relationships to be stronger among children whose mothers had a history of major depressive disorder. In other words, they were testing whether depression and attention influence each other over time and whether family history makes those relationships stronger. The study was conducted as a longitudinal study with the same 242 mother-child pair participants were followed over time. There were 5 assessments over 2 years, with assessments occurring approximately every 6 months, with researchers using several different measuring tests. First, the child completed the Children's Depression Inventory, which is a 27-item self-report measure designed to assess depressive symptoms in children and adolescents, which was completed at each of the 5 assessment points. The researchers also used eye tracking. The children completed a modified dot probe test where their eye movements were recorded after being shown pairs of faces, including sad and neutral faces, happy and neutral faces, and angry and neutral faces. Each pair of faces was presented for about 1 second, then the researchers measured where the child looked and for how long. This allowed the researchers to determine whether children spent more time looking at the emotional face compared to the neutral face. Eye tracking was used because the researchers believed it provided a more direct measure of attention than simply looking at reaction time. The children completed an attention task and the depression questionnaire. Meanwhile, the mothers completed diagnostic interviews to determine whether they had a history of major depressive disorder. These assessments were then repeated approximately every 6 months for 2 years, around the same time as the children's assessments. The researchers analyzed the data using a random intercepts cross-legged panel model, or an RI-CLMP, where the purpose was to determine whether the changes in depressive symptoms predicted later changes in attention, and whether those changes in attention predicted later changes in depressive symptoms. The results were different from the researchers' original hypothesis. In the end, the researchers did not find a clear bidirectional relationship like they predicted. Instead, the strongest finding was that depressive symptoms predicted later change in attentional biases. But the exact pattern depended on whether or not the child's mother had a history of major depressive disorder. For children whose mothers had a history of major depressive disorder, higher depressive symptoms predicted an increase in attention towards sad faces later on. This relationship was statistically significant with a p-value of 0.012. However, attention towards sad faces did not significantly predict later increases of depressive symptoms. For children whose mothers had never been depressed, there was no significant relationship between depressive symptoms and attention to sad faces in either direction. So the sad face finding was specifically seen among children with maternal history of major depressive disorder. The data showing attention to happy faces produced an interesting result. Among children whose mothers had never been depressed, higher depressive symptoms predicted decreases in attention towards happy faces. This relationship was statistically significant with a p-value of 0.004. In the end, paying less attention to happy faces did not predict a later increase in depressive symptoms. Finally, the researchers looked at angry faces. There was no significant prospective relationship between depressive symptoms and attention to angry faces. There was a trend suggesting that depressive symptoms might predict increases in attention towards angry faces, but the relationship was not statistically significant. The p-value was 0.052, which is just above the standard of 0.05 cutoff. Because of that, the researchers did not consider the angry face finding statistically significant. The biggest takeaway is that the researchers did not find the evidence that attentional biases cause depression in these children. Instead, the research suggests that depressive symptoms may change how children process emotional information. For children whose mothers had a history of major depressive disorder, increases in depressive symptoms were followed by a greater attention towards sad faces. One possible explanation is that depression may make sad emotional information more noticeable because it's more personally relevant to them. The researchers discussed something called the scarring effect, which states experiencing depression may leave lasting changes in the way someone perceives and processes information. In this case, experiencing more depressive symptoms may contribute to a stronger tendency to notice or focus on sad emotional cues. And this pattern appeared to be particularly strong among the children who already had a family history of depression. Another interesting finding was what happened with happy faces. Among children whose mothers had never been depressed, increases in depressive symptoms were followed by decreases in attention towards happy faces. This could mean that depression does not always make someone focus on more negative information. It may also make positive information less noticeable, making depressive symptoms potentially interferable with attention towards positive emotional cues. However, the results do not prove that depression directly causes attentional bias. Even though the study was longitudinal and looked at changes over time, the researchers explained that the statistical model cannot establish a definite causation. There could be other factors influencing both depressive symptoms and attentional processes, that depressive symptoms predicted later changes in attention, rather than saying depression definitely caused those changes. The results also showed that attentional biases may not be fixed vulnerability that is present before depression and may be more dynamic and change depending on a person's symptoms and context. In conclusion, this study examined the relationship between depressive symptoms and attentional biases in youth over a 2-year period. The researchers originally expected a bidirectional relationship, however, the results did not support this prediction. Instead, depressive symptoms were the more constant predictor of later changes in attention. For children whose mothers had a history of major depressive disorder, higher depressive symptoms predicted increased attention towards sad faces. For children whose mothers had never been depressed, higher depressive symptoms predicted decreases in attention towards happy faces. Attention itself did not significantly predict later increases in depressive symptoms. The result therefore suggests that additional biases may be dynamic and symptom-linked rather than simply fixed risk factors for depression. Personally, what I found most interesting about the study is that the results were not exactly what the researchers or I personally expected. The study helped me understand in better depth that depression can involve interactions among symptoms, cognitive processes, development and family history, and environmental experiences. These are a list of my references. The bolded one is the research study itself, and the other non-bolded citations were used to help me better understand and give concepts to things in the study that I was unfamiliar with. Thank you for listening to my presentation.